Hey guys, Omni here. I just got finished watching Wonder Woman 1984, and I don't know what I was expecting going into this movie. We've reacted to the trailers, but it never really gave me a full sense of what this story and focus was kind of going to be about. Um, and I got to say that this was a really heartfelt and in some ways kind of cheesy kind of movie, and I got to appreciate that too. Especially given the times that we're in right now. There was some really emotionally impacting moments in this movie that got me to tear up a couple of times. It really wears its heart on its sleeve and is not afraid to be this lovable and inspiring kind of best of humanity kind of story without going to any kind of spoilers or whatever. And this is just kind of what I feel like we need right now. It's got a little bit of a Bill and Ted kind of feel, like the Bill and Ted 3, Face the Music. The way that I felt like that movie that was, even though that was a heavily flawed movie, and this movie has its flaws for sure. It just the message behind it, even though it's not very subtle whatsoever, is something that I still wholeheartedly believe. It's one of the main reasons that I adore the Kingdom Hearts franchise, is just like, carrying that care, heart, and connection and believing in the best of humanity is really what I think the main drive and focus of this film is. Of course, the setting itself, 1984, lends itself quite loudly especially in the opening first act of the film. It's very much like the opening sequence we have with Wonder Woman very much feels like an 80s movie. Not only is it taking place in the 80s, and it doesn't kind of hold back on letting you know that this is in the 80s. It is the style, the tone, and even like the cinematography. Like, it almost feels like a superhero movie, especially more so than any that opening sequence feels like a superhero movie made in the 80s. And it can kind of take you out of it for a minute, but it's still really enjoyable to watch. Of course, we have Gal Gadot returning as Diana Prince, living, of course, decades since we last saw her after the tragedy of Chris Pine's sacrifice during the wars. And seeing how that still lingers and affects her in her social life and her professional life and all of that. And it really starts off with this strong emotional drive and connection. And then we're introduced, of course, to Kristen Wiig's Barbara Minerva. And you get to see these contrasting characters and how they build this relationship and this dynamic and how that takes its turn. Of course, we know that Chris Pine is back, and I'm not going to say how or why, but he just carries the emotional weight in this. And of course, just like even though Diana in the first movie was the fish out of water. This is the first time she's left the mascara. She's seeing the world of man for the first time, and he's the one leading her through that. I know myself and other people have kind of been concerned about that kind of being like a repeat kind of process, even though I find it entertaining. For some people, I know might get a little like repetitive, but they kept it really fresh. Now, this time around, of course, Chris Pine is the fish out of water, being astounded and in awe of all these advancements and lifestyles, conveniences, the fashion, and of course, the technology of the 1980s, and seeing that dynamic and that kind of flipping the script of that kind of parallel that they had in the initial movie was a lot of fun. And it was the chemistry between those two, and I think Chris Pine just can pull this off no matter what. They do just always, no matter what role I've ever seen him in, just has this charm that just pulls you in. And even though Gal Gadot was still fairly an amateur actress at the point when she made Wonder Woman 1, you can definitely see that she's definitely grown and evolved over these years. And I think even more so than we've seen her before, has just melted into this character. And there's a noticeable improvement in her emotional impact, her deliveries, her cadences, the way she carries herself, and just commits to this character and this role. She's really evolved and grown in this profession, and she's doing amazing. And she embodies this character more so than I think she ever has up to this point. And it's their dynamic, combining it together, it's just so endearing and so heartwarming to watch. And just like in the previous one, Diana still has this naivete to her character, this childlike wants and needs that she has, which is the kind of the lesson of the movie. And I'm not going to get into it too much. And Chris Pine, just like in the previous movie, was not only hopeful, but had like a realist morality to himself. He was definitely the moral anchor of that story, who saw the world how it was and was able to kind of ground Diana. And then, of course, you have the villains of the film: Maxwell Lord, played by Pedro Pascal, and Barbara Minerva, aka Cheetah, played by Kristen Wiig, and both are fantastic in their roles. And honestly, compared to a lot of the villains that we've seen in DC films prior, these are the most relatable, grounded, and I can understand their drives, their motivations, their backgrounds that push them down the paths that they take. And they have this grounded, relatable approach to these characters and the way they're portrayed and the way that they're handled. Of course, it does get very comic booky throughout the film, but that's the enjoyable part of it. I like seeing their evolution and their turns and the twists that we go along throughout the movie. And then, of course, you have Kristen Wiig's character, who noticeably and visually goes through multiple changes throughout the film, as we've seen in the trailers, to the point where she becomes the Cheetah. I do have to say that they do that fight in nighttime to, as Hollywood does, to try to mask some CGI and maybe kind of cut some corners on their CGI. And it is noticeable. It is not the best CGI I've seen. It's also not terrible. It just makes it hard to kind of see and get a good look at her at any given time. And when you do, it's definitely very obvious that you're looking at something CGI. And I would have liked to have seen them do something a little more practical as far as some of the more detailed shots that we have. But there's so much movement, so much action going on. And then, of course, they have it happening under this darkened sky so that there's not a lot of light going on. So a lot of that action is kind of obscured. But despite that, I do think that this climax holds up a little bit better than the one from the first Wonder Woman movie. The first two acts of this, while I do really enjoy them and they're really endearing, I think the first two acts of the first film were much more impactful and will leave a much more lasting impression on me than the ones in this. But then the third acts are the reverse. At the end of the day, I do really enjoy the movie, especially it does raise some questions, and I did look into it a little bit. Apparently there's a tie-in novel that goes a little bit more into how this connects to the greater DC universe, because as we know, when Wonder Woman shows up in BVS, she says that she had walked away from humanity over 100 years ago, and they kind of had to make some kind of reference to that in this tie-in to kind of explain how she's out and doing this type of stuff out in the open in this movie in the 80s, and then how we get to her saying that line in BVS. And it's more of a loose explanation, and it is still kind of like not the best one you could hope for, but it's not that she physically stepped away from from humanity those 100 years. She just stayed back from the personal attachment and letting herself give into those human desires, like relationships and stuff like that. That's more what she meant. It wasn't about, she wasn't just watching terrible things happen and doing nothing in the world. She was still actively participating and shaping the world. And they make a note to show how that can be perceived and gone under the radar. It's still a little weird, but it doesn't bother me at all. The explanation is something that I can accept, and the continuity so far in the DC cinematic universe has not been the most coherent given the current nature of the beast and structure of it right now. And then again, with the Snyder Cut coming down the road, that's going to shake things up yet again and leave a lot in question as to what is going to be kept as canon and what is not. So it's in an interesting place, but this was a fun movie. It is a feel-good movie. It makes sense that it came out on Christmas Day, and I do recommend it. If you've got HBO Max and you aren't able to get out to a theater, or it's not safe to get out of theater, of course, given the pandemic situation, definitely sign up for HBO Max, give it a watch. It'll be worth your time. And there's a lot on there. No, I'm not sponsored by HBO or anything, but it's a fun little service, especially if you like DC and a lot of the Warner Brothers catalog. But yeah, that's my take on this film. If you guys have watched it, I'd love to know your thoughts down below. We'll carry on the conversation after the video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will catch you guys next time. Take care, everybody.